Okay, I'm just waiting for this to come on to mute site. All right, so hi there everyone. Welcome to our 30th Gutenberg Times live Q&A. My name is Birgit Pauli-Haag and I'm your host and the publisher of the Gutenberg Times. And thank you all for coming online. For today's show, I'm in the presence of giants in the WordPress world. Let me briefly introduce our guest. And we have Helen Husandi, Director of Open Source Initiatives at 10up. If you missed her excellent talk at WordCamp US, you definitely need to put it on your watch list for the weekend. Hi, Ellen. I'm so glad to finally meet you. How long have you been contributing to WordPress and what has been your role in the core team?
I have been contributing to WordPress for 10 years, something like that, 10 years. Yeah. And I am one of the lead developers, whatever that means today. And I've been doing that for about 6 years, I think.
All right. Well, thank you. And next is Mark Jakeworth. Did I pronounce that right?
You did.
CTO of Strive Media and owner of Covered Web Services around the corner from my location in Tampa. Mark builds things with WordPress. And I first saw you in 2014 speaking at WordCamp Tampa on WordPress security. It was quite insightful and a lasting memory. Thank you. Welcome to the show, Mark. Same question for you. How long have you been contributing to WordPress and what has been your role on the core team?
I've been contributing to WordPress for horrifyingly 17 years, very long time. I started out just doing bug triage, just kind of paving the way for Matt and Ryan, who were the only people committing at the time. Worked my way up to commit access, and then lead developer. Since like 2017, I've largely stepped back from like day-to-day goings on in WordPress core. I'm still working with WordPress pretty much every day, but as far as like WordPress core development, especially Gutenberg go, I'm now in like a rather unexpected position of feeling like an outsider looking in.
Yeah. All right. Interesting. And we'll probably hear more about that in the later show. And also, last but not least, Riyad Benguela, JavaScript developer at Automatic and WordPress core contributor. Bonsoir, Riyad. How are you?
Bonsoir,
it's so nice. It's nice to see you. How long have you been contributing to WordPress, and what has been your role?
Thanks for having me. I guess I'm the new one here since I've been contributing to WordPress for, I think, by the start of Gutenberg, so like almost 5 years, I think. Yeah, my role on the project have been developer on the project, but I guess these days you can call me one of the lead developers of Gutenberg since I've been there from the start. So yeah, I try to do some coding and guide people around Gutenberg. Yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you so much. So thank you for coming together and making this discussion happen on how can we make it easier to create custom blocks. Just a word for our viewers. For those watching on the YouTube live stream, use the chat box next to the video player to pose your question and include where you're watching from. And here on Zoom, use the Q&A on the bottom of the screen or the chat bubble for your shared thoughts and questions. And please be kind, even if you disagree. This is a family-friendly endeavor. Another word to the question, the faster you get to your question, the higher is the possibility that's actually asked. If I have to read through a blog post first and then aloud, it's going to be a little bit hard for everybody. Be, as Andrea Middleton would say, be kind, be brief. And that's all I have to say. And I'm here in moderating it. I get out of the way and let you start kind of discussing what you're here to discuss. Helen, do you want to start?
Sure, I can do that. So since you mentioned my WordCamp US talk that was about building custom blocks for the White House, and in doing that, we realized, a a really great thing that happened in that development process was that we had a front-end developer at a different agency, right? So a lot of collaboration going on, a lot of making sure everybody was always working on something with such a short timeline. And a thing that really worked well for us was the front-end developer just focusing really on the front-end outcome, because that's what really matters, right? It's like, who cares about the tools behind a website if like your website isn't good, right? So really getting the front-end developer, getting everything polished, getting the markup, not worrying about the data yet, right? So just turning the slice and dice, right? Except today it's not Photoshop, it's like Figma probably. But really getting that front end in place with the markup, with the styling, and then really leveraging React, right? And reusing that same markup, inheriting the same styling, and bringing that into the editor blocks, right? And then that way we had this one-to-one preview in the editor, and where you would be doing like, you know, a PHP echo of your data on the front end. Then in the block editor, that's whatever the React component is that you want for that spot, right? Which is often like rich text or sometimes plain text. I think there needs to be something in between, but we can talk about that. So that's really what happened on that project. And in working on that, we realized, you know, this is very duplicative, right? You have the same markup in both places. And so that is still what it is now. And that's kind of where we are with a lot of custom blocks that are doing the dynamic rendering, right? So you have your PHP output and you have your block output, the block editor output, right? And they're using the same markup, but you have to maintain the markup in both places. Thankfully, you can use the same styling in both places, which is great. But how can we think about reducing that duplication, right? And there's so many different ways to think about it. I know that on in things that I was talking about, like with coworkers at TenUp, is like, could this be a place where people who are a little bit more JavaScript hesitant, could this be a place where we retain PHP as the source of truth, right? And keep PHP working without a build and whatever, if that's like a concern for people. And then could we do something kind of wild, like transpile PHP to JSX, and then the build process takes care of, you know, compiling JSX for the browser. So that's kind of where that started. And then with Mark, he was just messaging me one day about some custom blocks he was making. And I was like, oh yeah, let me tell you about this puzzle. And since Mark loves puzzles.
Yeah, you kindly infected my brain with this idea, and it took over an entire week of my life. Yeah, so yeah, Helen kind of proposed to me like, yeah, what if this could be easier? What if this didn't have to be, you know, write twice to get essentially one-to-one output between the editor and the front end? And like, you know, I think back to, you know, Matt called everyone to learn JavaScript deeply, and not everyone did. And honestly, React is hard. Like I probably learned React started in like 2016. And there's a lot to it. Like if you jump in, like you have Webpack, you have JSX, which is weird. Like, you know, you have to go through that whole flow of, well, why can't I just do like basic conditionals? Why'd I have to do this weird syntax? You know, newer stuff in React, like hooks, and you know the rules of hooks. You have to understand this like kind of complicated philosophy about like how you can use these things and why you can't just use them in ways you think you should be able to. So like getting started, even just with React, takes a bit, and then there's more on top of that with blocks. You have all these all these components you have to learn. You have to learn how, you know, the difference between like an edit function and a save function, and how the rules are slightly different there. And there are, you know, different types of blocks. I 4 different main types of blocks, and the boundaries are kind of blurred between them, and it can be hard to know like what's the best approach. You know, should this be a so-called dynamic block, or should I just be rendering out the basic content? But all that being said, the great thing about React is that it is composable. So like people get all, you know, caught up in, you know, JSX and Webpack and these complicated build routines, but like JSX is just sugar. just like the direct quote here from React.js. Anything you can do with JSX can just be done with plain JavaScript, because it just maps back to essentially a tree of these elements that you're creating. And so, like, my revelation was just, for a subset of blocks that don't require you to handcraft these intricate custom interactions, a lot of these blocks can be abstracted into like a simpler, more declarative format, or like even serialized into something like JSON or YAML, where you're just saying, like, this is what the block should look like. It should have a headline, it should have a photo, it should have an editable, list of paragraphs. And we can take that and we can create render code in PHP. We can create the edit code in React dynamically. There's no build step. You can just do it on the fly, at least for like simpler use cases.
So on the core team, we've been hearing that, like, for you can imagine that feedback we had like for a long time. And so things like, okay, we are duplicating code between the editor and the backend. Should this be a dynamic block or should it be a static block? How do we make that decision? And I don't want to write JavaScript. Why not you go ACF blocks and things like that? So this is the feedback we've been hearing. And in addition to that, so it became clear that folks need ways to build blocks easier. And they were leaning to these third-party solutions. So this discussion is still ongoing, and we keep discussing these things, obviously. In the beginning of the project, we needed to build something that is flexible, that should support like any use cases you can think of. And going the declarative path, like we are exploring right now, is not something that would help us achieve all the use cases we can support right now in Gutenberg. We need to be able to build a block that is completely static. We need to be able to build a block where the user makes adjustments, and we need to be able to generate things on the back end. So all these things were needed. So we needed something low level. And that's why we have the APIs we have right now. But we've been hearing all this feedback, and in addition to the ease of to the need to simplify things, there are other things people were asking of, which I can name a few. For example, there were folks using actually blocks in other CMSs in Drupal, and they wanted, for example, to use blocks that are built for WordPress. How to do so? That's something we don't have an answer right now. The other thing that was important for extenders, or I call extenders, is plugin authors and agencies sometimes, is that they wanted basically blocks when implemented initially were an editor concept. Something you see on the editor, you manipulate on the editor, but as soon as you save your post, it's just HTML. So the server doesn't know a lot about blocks. The declarative aspect of blocks is kind of missed. It's a missed opportunity where plugin authors cannot know what blocks are on the post content, and they cannot, for example, render them on their own on a headless WordPress and things like that. So that's another use cases we hear a lot. How can we make the server understand blocks more? How can the server parse blocks and edit them and serialize them back? The other use cases we were hearing of is front-end rendering for blocks. So right now, when you define a block, you define, I would say, 3 aspects of the block: the editor view, like what you see when you are editing the block; the saved view, the save function, like what is the markup that is saved in post content. But also for some blocks, dynamic blocks, you define the front-end rendering function. And there are other folks like WooCommerce are exploring right now that wanted more interactivity on the front end. So how to render blocks that are heavily JavaScript on the front end. So basically, this is a fourth state for the block. And And yeah, all of that discussion ended up, so that's why I started exploring this repository of mine, like called Blocky. Can we achieve all of that in one simple way? Now that we have this flexible API that allows everything, maybe there is a way like to implement something smaller, achieve smaller use cases, but checks all these boxes basically. And so yeah, that's how I came to this exploration. And yeah, and funnily, it was on the same weekend as Mark and Helen did their exploration, and I didn't know anything about it.
It was also funny is I almost gave my code name project the same exact name. It's got to be something with block in it, right? So I just called it block stub because I couldn't think of a good name that,
So there's going to be some truth to that. Like we are on the right path, right?
Must be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what you're saying about like the changes to the API over time is also something that's really important for people to keep in mind. So like a lot of things that we were able to do specifically on the White House in my case, but just the way that we're handling attributes and saving things. And we did some funny things on the White House that I have not previously talked about around not actually having full site editing, but sort of replicating some of those concepts. So we actually have some blocks that represent like the header area, but they don't render in the actual post content. We kind of slice them out. We don't really slice them out so much as like the actual front end render just does nothing, right? It's a no op. And then we actually retrieve those attributes out of the block, depending on how we've saved them, and use them in other places, right? But that way we have that representation in the editor because it is, as far as the user is concerned, a part of their content, right? They don't have like a clean separation of like, this is my title, this is what goes into post content, this is what goes into post excerpt. Like a normal human being using WordPress does not think in those terms, right? So I think, when we talk about like how cool these things were that we built, I know that a lot of it was easier or even just possible at all because of newer developments in the API that like weren't there even, a year ago, right? And that's also something that's really important to think about.
Yeah, I think like was it the version 2 of blocks where you can spread out your block properties that make it easier to share the CSS between like the editing view and the front end view. I think is like one of the last puzzle pieces that fell into place to even enable a conversation like this. Whereas before it would have been kind of a lot more work.
Yeah, theme editing basically and editor styles were like very difficult at the beginning because like for an editor to work in general, you need more markup. You need things to be rendered like buttons and things like that. So it was very complex. And yeah, the API version 2 was an attempt to solve that. And I'm hearing that it achieved some of that. So yeah, that's good. And there will be more of that. There will be basically right now what we do for blocks, for block styles is that we kind of wrap them in a container in order to allow theme authors to use the same style sheet between the backend and the front end. And hopefully in the future, we hope to be able to use the exact same style sheet without changes, and by leveraging iframes, like having the editor canvas inside an iframe. So we're not there yet, but that's also something that hopefully will make things easier, but this time for theme authors and not block authors.
Yeah, that's something I'm looking forward to as well, because I know we've had issues also with representation of width, right, in the editor. And I know that a lot of the exploration around iframes is that, right? So when you have the sidebar open, it's not just squishing it without regard to the actual content width.
Yeah, and media queries working properly because you have an iframe, right? You don't have to simulate it or anything.
Yes, or just let it look ugly when the sidebar is open, which happens. Yeah.
I mean, the entire concept of like WYSIWYG, because you're going to be editing this on a bigger screen, and the majority of your users are going to be having an experience on a small screen, and so like, yeah, there's like it's WYSIWYG, but for this giant range of experiences, which is it's difficult to do.
It's very difficult. Yeah. Thinking about like, other things that people are experimenting with and all of that. So we have these two experiments kind of colliding, I guess. But when people talk about like ACF blocks, I was looking at them. So I built an ACF block for my WordCamp US presentation because I would never otherwise have done it. It's like not a knock to ACF or anything, just like not a thing in my toolkit. And so I tried building one because I wanted to know what it was like. It's fairly smooth, but I think it still shows like how much we're still stuck in the same sort of mindsets that we have been for as long as I've ever used WordPress, right? So a dozen years or more, which is we just shove everything into form fields and put them in a box somewhere on your screen, right? And that's still like the mental model that a lot of developers have. And because we're so used to that on the developer front, we kind of forget that that's like not how other people use computers, especially now, right? Like the computer is supposed to be our tool to get stuff done, not we're supposed to be the computer's tool doing things the way the computer is telling us to do it, right? Like that's just not how it's supposed to be. And so like we don't have to force ourselves and our users to think about stuff in like little boxes in a form field on the side of your screen that has nothing to do with what's going on over there. And maybe I'll save it and maybe it'll look good or maybe it won't, and so it's still kind of in that land. But I do know that they're looking at using the editor components inside of their editor block rendering, right? So right now what they have is they create a panel with all the fields that you've defined with, whatever that, field type is, right? Because you can have like text and sliders and whatever else. So you still fill those out, but they're like the sidebar panel. So you have to have the sidebar open, which can create the squishing problems. And then as you enter data, it's actually doing a round trip. So the templating is only in one place. It's in PHP. But in order to render it, it sends those attributes back over, renders it, and sends it back. So it's a server-side render, right, as a block. And there are lots of issues with server-side render that people don't seem to realize. So it's kind of a weird experience. It'll be cool to see how they approach implementing the actual editor, the React components from the editor into the blocks, because I think that'll also show us like how people are thinking about it coming from that sort of mindset as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think ACF blocks, they kind of answer demand from plugin authors and from like agencies where they don't want maybe to lose time learning JavaScript and things like that. So it's easy for them. It's coming from all this WordPress mindset of having a fields API and basically form-based API where the forms are generated from the fields automatically and things like that. But I agree with you, like there's a lot of user taste. I watched a lot of user testing where the user is presented with the site and want to edit something and he wants to go there and edit it and then look, where do I edit this thing? I want to edit it in place and things like that. So yeah, it's kind of the same mindset that also led to full site editing. We want visual editing everywhere, and ACF blocks at the moment, at least, I was not aware of their new exploration. This is where the difference between why ACF blocks basically is not the core API and the core principles of Gutenberg, why Gutenberg is built this way and why APIs of Gutenberg are built this way. And visual editing is one of the main principles there.
This honestly, it makes me think back to kind of the predecessor to blocks, which are shortcodes, which are essentially, here's the name of my shortcode /block, and here are my input attributes, and it produces output. And like ACF is like solving the problem of people having to write square brackets and equal signs, but they're just taking that essentially shortcode format and just turning it into a form. But I guess fundamentally the problem there is we're like asking users to basically serve as their own render function, where they have to like look at these fields and they're like, okay, and that will go there and this will go there. And instead, like, from my exploration, I was thinking like, okay, what if that kind of, like short code plus attributes, block plus attributes idea, instead of being presented to the user as their input, gets presented to like a system that creates, as outputs, the actual output, the editing output, the saved editing output. So it's kind of like, taking that, instead of making them have to render that in their head, we can produce these nice experiences from those same inputs.
If we go, sorry, go ahead.
I was to say there's also some things that, again, because we're sort of still falling back to things that we know, like and are familiar with, just sort of broadly as a developer community, we're forgetting that there are things about post-meta that are not actually good for the things that we're, over leveraging it for, right? Because like there's no revisions of post-meta. I mean, you can make them happen, but it's not like a core API, right? I've done it. It's not fun to store post-meta on revisions. So there's no revisions. It doesn't come up in your searches, right? There are things about it that are not performant. It's not, right? Like if you want it to then be exposed, on a different layer somewhere, you have to do a lot more work to get it exposed. Whereas saving into block attributes, you get a lot more, even just from that, right? Not even to say anything about like, what if we were to go all the way with a static block and save the markup still, and then like, could we have something that still saves a markup and still renders it dynamically and still has attributes? Like, can we have all of the above? I don't know. But there are things where like, we're still just falling back to shoving things into a type of data storage that like doesn't actually make sense either. Right. And so like, this is our opportunity to like really rethink the habits that we've had as developers and come back to something that's like actually usable for the people. Yeah.
And I think, so you just asked, like, can we have all three? And yeah, so actually I was playing with this recently. There is a way where you can have, like Riyad was saying, like it's three, right? It's not two, you're not running twice, you're running three times. There's the editing experience, there's the front end experience, and then there's like what you are saving into the content of that. So like I was having problems where I had people where they're using WordPress SEO to like analyze their content and check their word counts, and they're saying, okay, I'm entering all this stuff in a block and it's not getting counted as words because WordPress can't see it. It was just a block with attributes. So I found out like, yeah, you can actually do all three. You can save the attributes back to the block, have a PHP render function, and also save like a, not a plain text, but like a simplified HTML representation of that block into that content. So then then it handles stuff like content analysis, and like now you can use WordPress search and find content in that block. So like I think it's possible that we can have the best of all three worlds.
Yeah, I agree, and I wanted to go a bit technical on this aspect precisely. Like how can we do that? Like how can we have a representation that basically represents 3 or 4 states at the same time? And this is where both our explorations kind of have a similar solution. They provide you with this template, and you define a template, and the compiler or the framework or whatever is behind is responsible for translating this template to all these 4 states. And this is only possible because for the past 5 years in Gutenberg, basically, we've been building these, I would call them primitives. And these primitives basically have representation in different states. For example, when you think about rich text, we have like rich text where you could use an edit. In content, we have rich text.save, and in the front end, it's basically just the serialization, it's the HTML and things like that. So basically what we're doing with these explorations, we're moving the distinction between the states from the block itself to these primitives. So that way, it's for a block author building a simple block. You just use primitives, build the templates, and it just works. But for advanced use cases, it's still possible. You can still build your own for states or build your own primitive that achieves the same thing. So I think it's possible as well. I think it also means that we are moving more and more things into the framework or into this tool, because initially this tool can be actually a dev tool instead of being in a framework. But we are moving more and more things, more complexity in the framework itself, while leaving basically the simple thing for the block author and leaving only the block author responsible of expressing his block template, I would say.
That's exactly how my thing works. Is essentially I'm constructing a tree, almost like a DOM tree, and each node is something that's called a renderable, and it has currently 2 states, like render PHP and render React, and each thing is responsible for knowing how to represent itself in a certain context. So
and it's very powerful.
Very, very powerful. I have simple ones like a paragraph, that has 2 different very simple render states, but you can do complex ones, like you could do a photo upload one, or combinations of these, and you're not going to get we're never going to get to the point where everything you could do with bespoke development you could do with something like this. There's always going to be limitations here, but you can push it a lot farther than just here are some simple HTML elements. There can be interactivity. It's just going to be a little curated. There's going to be some common patterns that you can kind of opt into with these elements that handle all that complexity for you.
Common patterns is a good word, I think, there. And one example I can think of that sounds like crazy right now, you could imagine having in your template something like you write post lists, and depending on where you are, it just works. For example, if you are in the front-end headless mode, you can use the REST API to get your post lists. If you're in the editor, it's the same thing. But if you want maybe a server-side render site, which is maybe more performant, it can be generated automatically from the PHP. And there's no distinction between dynamic block and static block. It's just the same thing. It renders post list. It doesn't care. It's the framework's responsibility to know how to render this block properly.
One thing that talking about patterns made me think of is also that now we have the ability to lock blocks within patterns. And so we're sort of that side of things where up until now we've been saying, these afford a type of flexibility that for a lot of custom developed sites, you don't want them to have, right? For whatever those reasons might be. But now we're wandering into territory where for some things that so far we've been creating as relatively simple custom blocks, maybe a locked pattern would end up working for them. And that's sort of an interesting place to be, as well as making sure we stay in front of what's happening, right? And really be deliberate in thinking about does this serve what we might otherwise be doing with a custom block? Are there places where we could replace some of those simpler custom blocks where we have a background image, a headline, and a button, right? And this is the cover block is essentially this, right? So can we now actually allow, the use of the cover block, and we just have it as a pattern that's been locked and you can't delete the things, and we do some magic on the front to hide things that you don't fill out, or, whatever it might be. So that's also interesting to me. I have not gotten into exploring that yet either, but I think that'll be interesting to see where people start drawing those lines as well.
I think that's super powerful because we're talking about this, a little bit as developers. So we're talking about tools that can make it easier for developers to generate custom blocks. But the locked patterns that you're talking about is a way for users to create custom blocks, which is insanely powerful. Like imagine if you could just be like, go in and then, puzzle pieces, puzzle things together and be like, okay, lock this down, give it a name. And, imagine if you had another site that wanted to use that and you could like slurp that in from the other site, like some custom block that you'd already made. Like the possibilities are pretty powerful here for users.
I think it's an interesting remark because if we take a look at both of our explorations, both examples we used are actually examples that could be solved with blocked patterns. So I think it's we will need a lot more use cases and then a lot more explorations for these things, like to come up to mature, to come up with the best solution for core. I think we are probably in a stage where the better way to go, the best way to go about this is actually as a tool, as not something built into core, because we need a lot of feedback on these things in order to make the right calls. So I would like to actually ask folks to check out these tools and see like where are locked patterns enough to solve all their use cases, or should we go to this path of adding more and more primitives to the framework and absorb more and more complexity and allow them to build blocks in a simpler way? I think it's a difficult decision to make, so we need a lot of work and iterations as a community there to arrive to the best solution.
Yeah, I see these things as like overlapping circles, and the boundaries between them are very blurry, and maybe one circle kind of grows and like it can encompass more use cases and the other one sort of shrinks, but like none of us are going to know like what the possibilities are, what people's struggles are, what those boundaries should be at this point. So I agree. At this point, we should just gather feedback, throw a lot of spaghetti against the wall, see what happens.
That's something I've been thinking about a lot too, like working in client land, is how many things we cannot really publicly talk about, right? And sort of the project, like not just being open source, but like open in process, right? Like the ethos of open source for WordPress. And so how can we give that kind of feedback without forcing it to be an open forum where you are kind of, in that case, suppressing a lot of feedback that you could be getting from people working on client projects, right? And especially like if you're really on top of your stuff, you're talking about projects that are in progress, and you can basically like never talk about those, right? In client land, it's like you can talk about stuff sometimes after it's completed and launched and everything has been fine for like a few days or a week, right? But in reality, like the feedback that I think like the Gutenberg team really needs, that like I would want to hear, right? If I was like the person in charge of this, which I'm not, just to be super clear. Like if this were like my domain, I would want to be able to hear from people who are doing stuff in flight, right? And who maybe are not able to share that stuff publicly. And so that's something that I actually started talking to a few people about over this past week, is like, could there be like a private but known forum for people to share that kind of information, right? Where like you're trusting each other not to share, things you're not supposed to be sharing in public, and that, the broader community understands like, yes, like there is a private forum. No, we're not streaming it live to all of you because there is confidential type of information that is being discussed, not because like you can't know about it or that it's something, I don't know, scandalous or something, but just not allowed to talk about it because that's the nature of client work. So, here's a forum that is happening, but, we're able to have like a defined forum to share these things, and for at least like the findings, like the overarching themes, right, of those discussions to be published as like meeting notes or whatever. So that's definitely something that's been on my mind recently, as well as I know a lot of other people that I've been talking to. So I'm also really excited about that, right? It's just getting that knowledge sharing, seeing the cool stuff people are building, right? It's like there's so many things like on these projects. And like I've been on other projects actually since the White House, and I rarely work on client projects. So it's been interesting to be like deep into these projects again. But I don't get to talk about them openly, right? And especially not the code part. We're all like, we're not really supposed to share like client code out in the open. So like, how can we actually like create a forum to be able to talk about these things? So yeah, I hope we can figure that out too.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, just because the kind of the bar is so high, if you're going to do like full-on custom block development, the bar is really high. So if you can clear that bar, you're a hot commodity, and you're going to be doing like bespoke development for a big agency. So yeah, it'd be great if we had a way to gather all that kind of, there's this wealth, this ocean of knowledge, but it's all just locked away privately.
I think seeing it also makes a difference too, right? Like one of the things that I've heard ever since I started contributing to WordPress is that WordPress developers don't use WordPress enough, like as users. Like we don't use the WordPress UI enough ourselves. And that's something that I think still is true, right? Like we have a lot of people who are doing really complex things in development, but like are not using WordPress itself as a tool for themselves on a regular basis. And so I could see that a developer could very easily miss that a thing like locked patterns even exists, right? Because they're just never using Gutenberg, the plugin, anywhere for anything. And you could very easily miss that because the volume of work being done is enormous, right? And it's very easy to miss that. And so that's something I think about too, is that like, ideally, yes, people would be using WordPress themselves for various things, but in lieu of that, also doing show and tell, I think can also make a big difference. Like when people see that difference, that was a big thing for me in my talk, was that seeing that difference between like being relegated to a sidebar versus typing in place, right? You can talk about it all you want, but until people see it, feel it, they're just kind of be like, okay, yeah, sure, that sounds great, but like, what does it really matter, right? Like, is the lift really worth it? And it's like, it's not until you really see it and you feel it in action that it's like, oh yeah, no, actually, this was worth the work, right? Like my experience with React is very low. Yeah, it really is. It's emotional, it's visceral, right? That like, whoa, this feels so cool. This feels so good to use. It's like enjoyable, right? Like that's something that with full site editing, right? We have go, no go later today, right? Another thing on my mind for today. And a big part of, testing full site editing is like, this is actually the most fun that I've had using stuff on the computer in a while, in a long time, probably, right? Like I converted my site to a theme, used a block-based theme using the full site editor, a couple weeks ago, and it was fun. Like it took a long time and I made a bunch of mistakes and like got really frustrated sometimes, but like overall it was really fun. And I ended up with an outcome that's like miles better than anything I could have imagined even just a few years ago. Right. And that's something that like is really easy to lose sight of. You're like, oh, I have so much to learn as a developer. I have so many things I have to do. I have so much stuff I have to update. How do I manage my budget? How do I manage all these things? And it's like, yeah, but these things are so fun to use now, right? Like having this visual editing experience, it matters. All that stuff really, really matters.
So do you think that's kind of a good way to pause? I like what you said about the forum to share things, but it's not public. And I just posted this week on the core blog a proposal to have developer hours that are only meetings, and they are recorded, but they're not shared publicly. So we can kind of cut out some of the sharings that are done and kind of hide things in the editing process. Would that be something that would take care of that, or that you think agencies would come in and help out and share things? Or does it have to be a different forum?
I don't know. I'll take a look at your post because I'm definitely very behind on reading everything. Like for me personally, like I want to take a look at what you've posted and keep talking to the people I've been talking to. On the agency front, I do think that there is some value specifically in that being like its own thing because of the confidentiality and the trust in each other, right? Like you have to really trust that the other people in that call are not going to go sharing your things, right? Or going behind your back and talking to that client, right? Like you just,
oh yeah.
And so, and there are places where multiple WordPress agencies are collaborating on the same client, right? And so like, there's just, I think there's a little more sensitivity in that area, and it is worth like being considerate of that, right? Rather than like trying to say like, okay, well, too bad. Like if you don't want to share your work openly, then you don't get to participate. Like that doesn't seem right, and it doesn't seem realistic, right? So that is something I am thinking about, and a big part of this too is like, you know, now having people like yourself doing DevRel, right?
Yes.
Like, so being able to leverage people like Ryan Welcher, who I think is like streaming right now. And it's like, why did you do it right now? But, you know, so people like Ryan Welcher, who just came from 10up, but now is doing DevRel at Automatic. But so he's a person who's like a deep understanding of those dynamics, right? And so like leveraging the people who we have and their expertise, and like being able to bring these groups together in a way that, you know, we can pull something out of it.
Yeah.
I'll take a look.
Yeah. Any other comments on? All right. I think we're coming to an end of our great discussion. I learned a lot. I also got lost a lot, but that's just my level of expertise kind of there. So thank you so much. It has been very, very inspiring. And I have only 2 more questions for you. So is there any announcement that you want to do in front of our audience that you didn't get in the discussion? And how can people get in touch with you? What's the best way if they have questions or want to follow up? Who wants to start, Mark?
Sure. Let's see. So the repo I've been working on around this idea, I'm going to make it public. It's not at all usable, but just take a look at it. So that'll be on my GitHub account. So GitHub /Mark Jakewith, and it's called Blockstub. So I'm going to put that up there. And you can get in touch with me. Twitter, email, first name at last name.me. Yep.
Thank you for being here. Ellen?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter, I guess, so Helen Hosendi. And I have that blog post that I published. So I guess you can comment there or just talk at me on Twitter. I do have a thing I guess I want to promote, which is that I will be talking more about the White House blocks and actually showing off more of them. I only showed a tiny little bit at WordCamp US, and part of that is because I'm doing a more in-depth look at them from a design systems and editorial experience perspective at Clarity Conf, which is a design systems conference, and that is happening in 13 days. So it's online and you can join. It is, I recorded this for something else last night. It is a conference with like conference pricing. In WordPress community, we get really used to WordCamps, that camp model. These are not $20 tickets for an event. But I think it is something that, especially if you're interested in design systems and the applications of them, I've been to it in person a few times, and it's a really great event. Just, you know, even online, I think it's going to be a wonderful event. So that's something that if you're interested in that side of the world at all, it's something worth joining.
So it's Clarity Conf or?
Yes, Clarity. Yeah, they just call it Clarity, but I think that I'll link it in the chat here.
Okay. Yeah.
So I don't have anything to announce, but you can find my exploration on my GitHub, Riyadh/Blocky. And yeah, I want to hear from everyone. Actually, I want to hear from blog authors, as I said earlier. So what are you trying to build as blogs, and what do you want to write as templates for these blogs? So yeah, and you can find me on Twitter or on WordPress Slack or GitHub, whatever. Just ping me, and yeah, happy to chat.
All right. Thank you so much. So the recording of this talk will be on YouTube in a few minutes once YouTube does its thing. And we will publish a transcript and all the links later on the Gutenberg Times later this week. So thank you all for coming, for all the watchers, people who came and watched this and do it real life. Thank you all, and I'll give you back your time. Bye. Thank you so much.
you.
Hi, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. All right, I'm ending the Zoom.